Hello and welcome to Fraud Talk, the ACFE's monthly podcast. I'm Rihanna Scoggins, the content manager for the ACFE, and today I'm joined by Jacqueline Garrick. She's a licensed clinical social worker, a veteran advocate, and the founder of Whistleblowers of America and the Workplace Promise Institute. After blowing the whistle on conflicts of interest and suicide prevention contracts at the Pentagon, Jackie found herself facing retaliation, isolation, and a psychological toll that mirrored the very trauma she spent decades helping others navigate. But instead of staying silent, she created a space where others could find support, solidarity, and resilience. Today, we're diving into a topic that goes beyond numbers and investigations. It's about people, specifically the people who risk everything to speak up when something isn't right. In this episode, we'll talk about moral injury, the power of peer support, and how trauma-informed workplaces can be a frontline defense against fraud. We'll be right back after this short ad.
Every fraud case has consequences, but how quickly you uncover and resolve it depends on the tools you use. Case IQ is the investigation management platform built for corporate fraud teams. From intake to resolution, streamline your workflow, protect sensitive data, and close cases faster with confidence. Visit caseiq.com/fraud talk and take control of your investigations today. And now, back to this month's episode of Fraud Talk.
Jackie, thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, can you give us a brief overview of Whistleblowers of America and the Workplace Promise Institute and the work that you do there?
Sure. So I started the Whistleblowers of America in 2017, and then 5 years ago, we added the Workplace Promise Institute as a way of getting together with the people who follow our organization. And the main purpose of Whistleblowers of America is a peer support program for people who have made a disclosure of some sort of wrongdoing, like fraud, waste, and abuse, or discrimination, harassment in the workplace, and then they have suffered and are dealing with some form of retaliation. And that has caused major psychosocial or life disruptions that we try to help them deal with and provide some coping mechanisms. And that becomes the focus then of the conference. And we also do monthly roundtables that focus on specific topics. But we really try to bring this community together so that they can help support and uplift each other.
That's wonderful. So, what inspired you to create Whistleblowers of America? Where did this idea start?
Desperation. I don't know that I felt as inspired as I felt like I was looking for my own answers. And I just couldn't find anybody to connect with or talk to. I had made what I felt were disclosures about conflicts of interest at the Pentagon over suicide prevention funding. And then I was facing this blowback, this negativity, this criticism, and I wasn't really sure what to do. And I made my disclosure and thinking it was going to get better, and it did for a short while. And then it just got worse, and the situation felt hostile. It was stressful. I was starting to have my own nightmares and my own reactions that were very reminiscent of the work I had done with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I was working in a suicide prevention space at the time. And I just began to feel this commonality with the combat vets. So a hostile work environment and a combat zone is something I've often compared, just because you have that emotional response to the betrayal, the moral injury, the identity disruption. It becomes very similar. And I just wanted to talk to somebody else and really couldn't find anybody who could really give me guidance. And it took a lot of slow hunting, pecking kind of conversations to find people who were willing to talk and share their common experiences. And I thought, well, it really should be easier than this, because you don't necessarily know if you need an attorney and how to hire an attorney. And, that's a minimum of a retainer was like $7,000. and the IG, they sound like they're your friends, but are they really your friends? And so who do you talk to and who do you get advice and get information from? And so that's where I really landed around by then that was about 2015, 2016 when I was going through all this myself and just trying to figure it out and just couldn't find the help that I was looking for.
I think a lot of really great things are often born out of necessity, right? So you've said that you didn't even know you were a whistleblower at first. Can you walk us through that moment of realization?
Yeah, so it was on a phone call with somebody from HR, Human Resources at the Defense Department. And she was the first person to ever call me a whistleblower. And of course I said, no, that's not me. All I did was, make this and that's when she said, well, what you're describing is a PPP. And I was like, you're speaking a language I don't understand. And she was like, I'm going to send you an email. I'm going to give you some websites. You'll read and you'll file these complaints with these agencies. And, that alphabet soup, the PPP, the Prohibited Personnel Practices, the Office of Special Counsel, OSC, the Merit System Protection Board, the OIG, the Office of Inspector General, General Counsel, the GC. I mean, all of this was like a new world to me. And just learning about all of that was, more than I expected. So that initial phone conversation, I should probably be really grateful for her because she really did sort of give me more information, even though she couldn't help me. She could just give me information and resources.
Gotcha. So you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but terms like betrayal, battle, and survival come up a lot when talking about whistleblower experiences. Can you explain the idea of moral injury? I know you mentioned it before, and sort of how it shows up in the whistleblower journey.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question because we're so used to thinking about moral injury and veterans with combat experiences and combat trauma, and that moral injury is really about recognizing or facing injustice or feeling like you were complicit in something that went against your own personal ethics or code of conduct. So I really see how a moral injury and whistleblowing comes together because for the most part, whistleblowing becomes very adversarial. And your adversary is usually somebody or something like an organization or a person like a boss or a supervisor that you've trusted, that you've respected, that you feel like you've been very loyal to. For many whistleblowers, they've been professionals, whether they've been social workers or doctors or auditors. They've been in their career space 10, 15 years sometimes before getting involved in whistleblowing, sometimes even longer than that. So you have this identity and this loyalty to an organization, to a profession. And when the retaliation starts and it becomes hostile and adversarial, then it changes how you see the world. And we call it that shattering of worldviews. The identity you once held on to is being chipped away. You're being called disgruntled, tainted, disruptive, disloyal. I mean, all those words are used to describe whistleblowers instead of seeing them as ethical and hero and relator, truth teller, lamplighter. We've even kind of gone to Microsoft and Merriam-Webster Dictionary and said, hey, you really need to change these definitions because they don't mirror what the whistleblowing is doing. And you're causing more stigma and you're creating this injury that really changes how somebody feels, not only about themselves, because that is another aspect then of how your mindset starts to change, but it's changing how you're relating to the world. And that has a great psychological and social impact as well.
Absolutely. So You sort of mentioned this identity disruption. And when we typically think of whistleblowers, we think often of, the issues they face, like career setbacks, but they can also experience identity disruption, like you mentioned, depression, even homelessness. Why is retaliation so psychologically devastating?
Well, so I think retaliation is trauma. It's according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that the APA uses, there's such a thing as non-partner adult emotional abuse. And that's what this is. Whether it's through things like gaslighting, mobbing, marginalizing, shunning, devaluing, double binding, career blocking, bullying, counter-accusing, and these are things that I've identified as in what I call the whistleblower retaliation checklist, because those are the domains, and then there are indicators for those things. And what I believe I've been able to do is start to categorize and catalog how retaliation then becomes traumatic and a stressor and can cause things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, and can even lead to somebody feeling suicidal.
So you mentioned how you and your team at Whistleblowers of America have been categorizing and sort of developing a taxonomy to name retaliation tactics. Could you walk us through some of the most common ones and why you believe this taxonomy is so important?
Right. So the ones I just mentioned, like the gaslighting, because that really starts to impede the credibility of the narrator, right? So if I'm telling you, hey, this is broken, and you're telling me, no, it's not, you don't really know, you're making too much out of it, go do your job. And then you marginalize me. You move me to a smaller office. You take me off my team. You shun me. You don't invite me to meetings. You devalue my work. You give me a lower performance evaluation than I've ever had before, or you write me up for misbehavior or some minor infraction. I've had whistleblowers who were written up for being rude. Again, not illegal, but they're intimidated and frightened and bullied. They're harassed. They're humiliated. That becomes the being embarrassed in front of your coworkers. So if I'm the medical director and I'm the subject matter expert in the room, but now all of a sudden you're interrupting me and you're rolling your eyes when I talk, or you're the watch checkers, the, or, you don't even acknowledge me when I talk. And it's those microaggressions
Mm.
that send a message to everybody else who's watching that something here is amiss. And we know it when we see it. We all recognize those behaviors, the gossiping, the plagiarizing somebody else's work or not giving them credit for an achievement. All those things start to build a profile of what retaliation looks like.
Mm.
And that's how I can start to document, well, these things taken together are harmful because they're systematic and they're targeting. It's not a one-off, oh, the boss had a bad day and he was mean to everybody. That's not this. This is something much more long-term, more sustained, and it creates this hostile environment.
Absolutely. So, with that taxonomy and that knowledge of, these are specific things that are happening, what do whistleblowers then do with that knowledge? Like, is that used when they're in a court battle or, how does that get utilized?
So ultimately, what I would love to see happen is that if we can standardize this checklist that I've created, that we can go into these courts or any kind of judicial proceeding, because some of our cases aren't even inside the US, and we can help develop a standardized tool that helps the courts and the judges understand this is what retaliation looks like and this is what it does. Because that, to me, is the only way we'll ever get accountability. And instead of things like pain and suffering being an afterthought, here's 10,000 or 20 or even 500,000, if we're not looking at this as a statistical value of life loss, and we see it from a disability perspective, then I don't think we're ever going to, one, compensate people or even help make them whole again. And certainly the accountability measures for causing that kind of harm, some of these big corporations or even governments are able to shrug it off and walk away and go, okay, well, we'll write 20 grand off as a business loss. We want it to be much more meaningful to make whole the employee. And for some of these organizations, maybe to have pause and think about what they're doing before they do it.
Absolutely. So I want to talk more about the work that Whistleblowers of America does. You've described connecting with peers as raising your own army. What does that support look like? What did it look like for you?
Yeah, so I think for me, I mean, it was very powerful when I started to connect with other people. And at first it was mostly other women, and we were able to really share experiences and share stories. And I remember one of them was like, oh, you're going to file your paperwork, and they're going to file a jurisdiction, and they're going to say, oh, there's no jurisdiction here. And be ready, because that's what they're going to do, and have your stuff ready. So when they file, you file. And sure enough, she was right. I filed. They said I didn't have jurisdiction, but I was ready for that. So I filed that I did have jurisdiction. And it was like they filed, I filed, they filed, I filed. And it all happened fast because I was ready, because she prepared me. When you're not ready, that could really feel terrifying, right? You think you've done all this work, and I was pro se by then, without representation. So you think, I've got this, and then all of a sudden, all these words and terms start coming at you that you don't really know much about, because unless you're an attorney, you've not had this experience. So you may be very professional, but I'm professional in social work. I understand psychosocial assessments. I don't know anything about admissions or interrogatories, or at the time I didn't anyway. So it was really helpful to have somebody who understood me, coaching me through that. And then I think it was when I was talking to somebody, I put up Whistleblowers of America. We started a website, and I was posting things on LinkedIn and other social media. And somebody reached out to me and said, hey, me too. I'd love to chat with you. So I thought, well, why not, right? So we got on the phone, and she told me she had been in law enforcement, that she had a weapon, and she was thinking about killing herself. And that's when I really thought, we've got to do more. We've got to get better at this, because we shouldn't let people suffer alone, no matter who they are. And I thought, for everything I ever knew about combat stress, that this was the same kind of thing, except it was a workplace. And I've had combat vets tell me, being shot at was scary. Being retaliated against was personal, and hurt in a deeper way than, enemy combatants shooting at each other is harmful, definitely dangerous, right? I take nothing away from that. But retaliation is very personal, because it's an attack on you and your identity.
Definitely. So what resources, what support models are you putting together, you have put together at Whistleblowers of America?
Yeah. So we are primarily a volunteer-based peer support network. We have utilized social work students who help us do some intakes. So that's been a wonderful bonus. And what we do is, once we've done intakes or we've gotten to know cases, is we really try to go back into our network, and we've probably talked to over 1,100 whistleblowers in over 30 countries at this point. And we try to find people with common experience, and we reach out to them. And, like if you were a social worker or an engineer or a pilot, I can reach out and say, hey, I've got somebody else that's in our network. The two of you might benefit from chatting with each other. And then once I have permission from both parties, we connect them with each other. And that's how we do the peer support work. And peer support is an evidence-based, a trauma-informed model. We have a code of ethics we share with people. We go, hey, here's sort of the parameters for this. We have never had a problem, not good, where people have said, oh, this is terrible. We started the annual conference 5 years ago as a way of actually bringing people physically together. And we do the monthly roundtable because it's an opportunity to get people on a topic area that some of our group or might have an interest in. And it's a way we get together on, I think, the fourth Tuesday of every month. And we just have a panel. We have a discussion. And so that's our primary ways of connecting. We're looking at doing and offering more opportunities. We just started an associate member program so that people who join can, behind a firewall, be connecting with each other a little bit more on their own. We'll have more resources there. We started a newsletter to kind of help share stories. And then, of course, all the roundtables and everything we do, we record, and we have all of that available on our YouTube channel and like Spotify and on some of those other platforms as well, iHeartRadio, so people can listen to us even if they can't join. And we find that our subscriber rate every month goes up because people are looking for, they're just looking for that information. I mean, you know how this goes, right? People need to feel informed.
Absolutely. That's wonderful that you have been putting together those resources that you didn't necessarily have access to when you needed them.
Yeah, not at all.
So for anti-fraud professionals listening, investigators, compliance officers, HR teams, what should we do to better support whistleblowers?
Well, I think it all begins with the listening to the narrative. What is in the story? And even if there are things that don't sound true or make sense, that's the opportunity to try to understand the perspective of the employee, to really hear them out. Lots of times whistleblowers will tell me, oh, well, I filed the complaint. And I'm like, well, did you give them all the information? No, I'll give it to them when they interview me. Well, they might not interview you if they don't have all the information up front because they're not going to have the full impact. Or if you have if you think you know your witnesses, don't wait to put that list together. Like, get your witness list together and get affidavits. Like, get people to tell you what they'll testify to for you. Because very often you might think you have names of people, but then when the IG goes and asks them, they say, oh no, I never said that, because people get scared. So I think it's mitigating that fear as well, like, and making sure that people understood the process, that they've shared everything they wanted to share, that they felt heard, that they felt listened to, and in a real way, right? Not this patronizing, that these are smart professionals. For the most part, they are the subject matter experts, whether it's, mechanical or, airplane parts or shipbuilding or mental health or medical care. They're the ones who will know, was the operating room clean and sterile before the patients came in? You don't want to be that patient, or you don't want your family member to be that patient who's going into an operating room that hasn't been properly sterilized. But unless you understand what the nurse or the doctor is saying, then you might miss some of the nuances of the reporting. And I think, to be honest, with the, what are you going to do with the information? Do you make a recommendation? Is it going to go bad? I mean, the biggest fear I hear all the time is, well, if I go to the IG, aren't they just going to take everything I tell them and go to my boss? So it's also protecting that confidentiality, having those firewalls between the information, doing the best to protect the identity of the whistleblower, and then really making sure that if there's retaliation, there's accountability for that. Like, that should really be dealt with swiftly. It shouldn't have to take a court case for whistleblower protections to be enacted. And to really, if a whistleblower comes back and said, hey, you interviewed me, and now I've been removed from my job, or I've been moved to another floor, I've been taken off the team, I would love for the person to.
What does a trauma-informed workplace actually look like? And how does that relate to fraud prevention and preventing misconduct?
Yeah, so I think that's where it gets complicated. Because I would say whistleblowers they deal with that 1-2 punch, right? So the first thing they see is what's the wrongdoing. So if I know water is being contaminated, there's an environmental hazard, there's a part missing, something's going to blow up, patients are going to get sick, children are going to die. If I know that and I say, this is what's broken, I need you to fix this, and you tell me, no, you're crazy and you're stupid, then the first part is I know there's real harm. The second part is now I'm dealing with the retaliation. And there's only so much fight a person has in them. So am I fighting for this, or now am I fighting for myself? And what tends to happen, and that's part of the gaslighting, is we stop looking, and that becomes the cover up. Don't look over here, look over here. So when I say something needs to be trauma informed, the first understanding is that there was harm somewhere, and that reaction to harm is going to cause that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response in somebody. So if I'm a whistleblower and I'm a real champion of my program, I'm going to dig my heels in and I'm going to fight for what I think is right. I'm not going to go, well, I think it's time for me to go home, and I'm going to go find another job, and I'm going to, you can contaminate the water for 10 more years because me and my family, we're moving. It's understanding that these issues are highly reactive for the person who's reporting them. And then if there is that retaliation, they're in this double fight now. And that understanding the stress and the anxiety that causes is, I think, important for anybody dealing with this space, is because it becomes such an emotional issue. I often compared whistleblowing to like family court. There is two parties. They both care about the outcome. It's just a matter of who's going to dig in their heels. How hard are they going to fight? And what's a good outcome? And sometimes there's so much destruction that goes into the fight. It's hard to get to a good outcome. It's either going to cost the company millions or billions of dollars, or it's certainly going to cost the whistleblower their lives, their livelihood, their sanity, their families suffer. There's a lot of sacrifice surrounding the whistleblower. So if you can be more informed and more mindful about how you're approaching some of these investigations and some of these people, it could help in the long run. Because in the long run, look, companies want to save money and keep doing business. They don't want the impact, but very often, instead of remaining open-minded and thinking about whistleblowers as this very important part of continuous process improvement, it becomes adversarial. And sometimes that's, I think I've even seen now where Transparency International identifies the adversarialness of the process as being part of the definition of whistleblowing. Because if I say to you, this is broken, and you say, oh yeah, you're right, it's broken. And I say, well, I've got some ideas about how to fix it. And you say, well, let's go get coffee and figure it out. We've not engaged. There's no retaliation. There's no fight. We're on agreement. We don't often think about that as whistleblowing, when in fact it indeed is. But it's just part of the normal day, which is how most of these things should be. So I think that would be my ultimate goal, is even to see less people thought of as whistleblowers, more people treated with dignity and respect in the workplace, having their opinions and ideas heard, even if they seem different or divergent from maybe what the boss or the supervisor is thinking, but to take that minute and listen to what might be wrong or what might be broken and how that might matter, and then work on troubleshooting it. Because again, these champions, even if they're wrong, still maybe need to be heard.
I think that's a wonderful goal, is to just take out the adversarial portion of it and that retaliation, and to just let it be a conversation of betterment, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So my last question for you, what advice would you give to someone who suspects fraud or misconduct but is afraid to speak up?
Well, so first, always have your ducks in a row. And if it means having a conversation with an attorney or some other advocate, like if water is contaminated, who in your space would be the advocate for that? Is there a local nonprofit? Is there a national nonprofit? Who do you go to that is knowledgeable about that and knowledgeable about the laws? Make sure you know. And then just be prepared. Like, what's your evidence? Make sure you've obtained your evidence legally. You can't steal documents. Just because you think your boss is a crook, you can't go into his office and steal his ledger. You have to do everything legally, honestly, with as much integrity. You might not be able to take documents, but maybe you can take pictures, and never use the organization's computer. Always try to get things as legally as possible. Don't send emails from your .gov because the gov is listening. And just be mindful. If it's legal to record things, record it. It depends upon sometimes the state and what those rules are. But I think those are important things to do. I always tell people, keep a diary, because your contemporaneous notes, on Tuesday this happened, on Wednesday this happened. If that was 2020, it might not be what's clear in your memory in 2025. So have that log, and then if there is evidence for what you wrote, tab that in there or make a note like what the document is that this note is referring to. And then before talking to an attorney or anybody, have your narrative, your resume. Always make sure that's up to date so that you can show your positionality in the organization. And then have a hierarchy. What's your org chart look like? So if I'm here in the organization and I'm reporting somebody here in the organization, am I in the right chain of command? Because it really helps the listener, whether that might be your own attorney or a judge or opposing counsel, understand, how do you know this is fraud? Well, I was the bookkeeper. Oh, well, then you have the right positionality. But if you're saying, well, I was the receptionist, I was answering the phone, and, they logged all these hours, but they were never in their office. Well, you don't know that's fraud because maybe they have another office or they're working from somewhere else. It's just that position in the company is going to matter to how believable you are and how reliable your documentation is. So, I just think people need to be mindful of not just their narrative and how they're telling the story, but also who the listener is and how is the listener going to digest this information.
Definitely. I think that's great advice for anyone who might, potentially need that. So I said that was my last question. I lied. Where can people learn more about Whistleblowers of America?
Sure. We have a website, www.whistleblowersofamerica.org. We also have a website for our conference, which is the workplacepromiseinstitute.org. So, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, X, and then of course subscribe to our YouTube channel. All of that, there are links at the bottom of our homepage on our website for how to find us and to learn more about what we're doing.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jackie.
Thank you for having me. This was a nice conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Absolutely. And thank you for listening. You can find this podcast along with all other episodes of Fraud Talk on acfe.com, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This has been Rihanna Scoggins, signing off.